For all zero people watching this, wait, let me try that again. For all zero people watching this who haven't heard of Euphoria, it's the hot new HBO show, and it's pretty good. The first season was massively popular, and I'd even go as far as to say it's probably the defining show of my generation. I mean, I think it pretty accurately captures what it's like to grow up in the era of the internet, and it's able to do so while not talking down to its audience, most of the time at least, which is a lot more than I can say about most teen dramas. But at the same time, if you were to tell me to elevator pitch it to someone, I'd probably say it's like a CW show, except it has ambition, and I realize that's a compliment that comes with about as much backhand as an abusive stepfather, but hear me out. It's a show that thinks the world of itself. This is evident through all the impressive lighting and camera tricks that honestly go a long way to keep me engaged, but at the end of the day, it's a pretty by-the-numbers story about conventionally attractive 20-somethings pretending to be high schoolers finding their way in the world. I think this formula can work, but you have to do something with it, right? While Euphoria definitely does have a lot of style and flashiness in terms of its presentation, the easiest way to set yourself apart from similar shows is with characters. It's kind of what makes or breaks these high school dramas. It's the difference between something like Freaks and Geeks and 13 Reasons Why, and I feel that in terms of character writing, Euphoria falls somewhere in between the two. Don't get me wrong, when it's good, it's good. I think Rue really works as this unreliable narrator, and her relationship with Jules is consistently interesting, and I'm always excited every time they share a scene together. I can say the same about Nate, who plays the role of the piece of shit asshole fuckface really well, and wouldn't you know it, the main plot of the first season revolves around these three. But basically every other character fits into the classic high school stereotypes you'd expect, whether that's the preppy cheerleader, or the dude bro jock, or the dominatrix? Scratch that last one, but I'm sure you know what I mean. The supporting cast of characters feel half-baked to say the least, and most of their subplots honestly feel like filler, but the great thing about being picked up for a second season is that as a writer, you can expand on parts of the show that weren't given enough time, so surely this isn't a problem with the second season. Says the YouTube video with nearly 30 minutes of runtime left. Anyway, since Euphoria is such a character-driven show, I feel like the best place to start is... Gotcha. Now that I have thoroughly deceived my audience, I can talk about the thing that no one who actually watches this show cares about, the filmmaking. After all, for most, it's the thing that's going to passively wash over them. It only really sticks out if it's particularly good or particularly bad. I'll get more into that in a second, because we kind of have to start with the fact that Euphoria has a bit of a style problem. The glittery neon aesthetics act as the glue that holds the first season together. In a lot of ways, the look of Euphoria feels like the first concrete idea the creators had for the show. It's honestly the thing that intrigued me the most about it at first, but I can see how this can be distracting to some viewers, especially considering how overbearing it can be at times, but the team behind Euphoria clearly had a vision, and I can respect that a lot more than if every scene was shot reverse shot with flat lighting. But over time, its shimmery, overblown nightmare aesthetics became synonymous with the show itself, so as a creator, it would be really easy to take this idea and run with it when developing the second season. But to my surprise, a lot of effort has gone into making the season 2 visually distinct from the first. While the first season is most reminiscent of an LSD-fueled trip in a 50s-themed 80s diner, season 2 has the look and feel of a grungy, piss-yellow tinted heroin vendor. I can appreciate the special ops team behind Euphoria trying something different, but I'm really only going to care if these changes service the plot in some way. And now this is the part where I have to put on my big meanie head hat, because guys, there's no way to sugarcoat it, this season is a fucking mess. And while Euphoria does have a crew which I'm sure works very hard for not enough money, virtually every creative decision regarding the show can be traced back to one man. Writer, director, goblin outside your local Denny's, visionary extraordinaire, Sam Levinson. Very early on, it's abundantly clear how little direction this season has. While most shows usually try to outline the basic plot of the season and the beats they want to hit, Euphoria makes the bold choice to ignore basic writing conventions and instead opts for the strategy of yes-anding its way through the 4 plot-relevant sticky notes that line the walls of HBO HQ. This lack of focus is felt through virtually every aspect of the season as well, from the pacing to the tone and even the acting. I guess I should start there, since at least for me it was the most immediately jarring difference between the two seasons. Every time an event happens and a character is reacting to said event, they bug out their eyes, they flail their bodies wildly, and they give the most exaggerated version of their performance that they could possibly turn in. I'm gonna include a clip right here just in case you don't really get what I mean, because it's one of the funniest examples of this problem and it requires minimal context. Basically, after finding out that Jules has spoken to another human being, Jules becomes inconsolably upset and bursts into tears on the spot.
It was nice to meet you. I'll see you later, Rube.
Nice to meet you.
It's like nobody told the cast that they aren't in a cartoon. And speaking of cartoons, it's with a heavy heart that I must report to you that Euphoria Season 2 is paced like an episode of Family Guy, complete with cutaway gags that last for minutes longer than they should and virtually non-existent plot progression. Pacing an episode like this completely destroys any tonal consistency that the show could have had. In Season 1, this surprisingly isn't really a problem. The comedy and the fourth wall breaks don't really take away from the big dramatic moments. Season 2, on the other hand, feels like the writers experimenting with the idea how much tonal whiplash is too much tonal whiplash. This is mostly an issue because there's not really a plot to link any of these scenes together, just a series of loosely chronological, vibe-heavy events. It also doesn't help that Rue's narration is much more inconsistent here. In the first season, each episode focuses on a single character. The first 10 or so minutes give us backstory for the character, and the rest of the runtime builds on any themes the opening set up, and I don't really need to explain further than that. I'm sure you've watched A Thing before. But Rue's narration is integral, not only to give context for these characters and any decisions they may make, but also to move the plot forward. And while narration is admittedly a pretty clunky way to dump exposition on the audience, it gets the job done here, and that's really all it needs to do. In Season 2, narration is sprinkled throughout these episodes seemingly at random. I mean, they start to do the Season 1 thing with Fezco and Cal-centric episodes, but then they just kind of stop doing it, which is fine, I guess, but I don't know why you wouldn't have an all-or-nothing approach to the structure of these episodes. It's part of what makes something like Episode 5 so refreshing. For once, the writers are able to take a single idea and run with it instead of ping-ponging between side plots that I don't care about. One more thing, the music. Many Euphoria scholars, commonly known as fucking losers, have argued that the show's soundtrack is padded with way too much top 40. As for this fucking loser, I don't really mind most of the time, with the big exception being the extended flashback sequence where it feels like they're trying to speed run through the music of the late 80s and early 90s. And although I'm mostly impartial to these decisions, I do wish they would lean into the original score by Labyrinth a little bit more because, much like the first season of the show, it's pretty good, even if it does have some cringe moments. So right about now, you're probably starting to mentally recover from my expert level galaxy brain deception, so I guess it's time for the main event. A reoccurring motif throughout the show is trauma and the many vices that can be used to cope with said trauma. I know I'm not exactly charting new territory by saying that. I mean, the show is literally called Euphoria, but I think this gives us a good baseline to understand where the writers were coming from when they were developing these characters. So to recap the first season a little bit, Rue starts off the series as a big old crack addict. She's popping every pill and snorting every line she can get her grimy little hands on, that is, until she meets Jules. In a lot of ways, the relationship between these two is the most functional one that either of them have ever had. They really do bring out the best in each other, and this includes the maintenance of Rue's sobriety. I know I've said it before, but I really do love these two together, and most people agree that Euphoria is at its best when it's focused on these characters. Let's just say there's a reason why I can't go 5 minutes on Twitter without coming across a #RulesFanCam. Also, props to Hunter Schafer and Zendaya. They play off of each other super well and bring the most consistency out of the cast as far as good acting goes. Also, I would be remiss not to mention the two specials that take place in between the events of Season 1 and 2 that exist for two reasons. The first reason is for a change of pace stylistically. I talked earlier about how Euphoria might just be the defining show of my generation, and this is true even to its core. It really does know how to cater to its ADHD-ridden target audience. Like seriously, I think the editor was taking a page from Rue over here and took a little bit too much Adderall, am I right, fellas? Both of these episodes revolve around a single conversation. As a result, the pacing is much slower than a typical Season 1 episode, and the audience has a lot more time to breathe and soak in what's happening. The writers clearly put a lot of thought into how these conversations would flow naturally, but also how to keep them engaging for the audience. The Rue-centric episode might just be my favorite one in the series just because of how much it turns the restrictions that this new strip-back formula brings into a strength. The second reason these specials exist is to fill out the world a bit. Since Rue is the primary lens through which we see the story in Season 1, I think letting Jules have an episode where we see the events from the first season is pretty effective, even if it is a glorified way to retcon some of her prior behavior. The episode also opens a dialogue about how being someone's anchor to sobriety isn't exactly fair to either party involved, which is something I honestly wish the show explored a bit more. I don't want to dwell on any of this for too much longer because plot-wise they really aren't that important, but I actually really like the idea of these more relaxed episodes that basically just exist to let us know where our leads are at mentally. I think it works as a pretty compelling way to get the audience ready for what's to come in Season 2. So Rue starts off Season 2 as a big ol' crack addict. She's popping every pill and shooting every heroin she can get her grimy little hands on, and yes, through a series of events in the Season 1 finale that are honestly not worth explaining, our two leads are not on speaking terms. But don't worry, it doesn't last long, because in the first episode of Season 2 they make up, and I'm kinda conflicted about this moment, because as an event in a TV show, it works. We've been waiting over 2 years for this payoff, and seeing these characters together again at last is satisfying. However, in the context of the story, Rue and Jules have only been apart for a couple weeks, so with that in mind, it takes away some of the punch that this scene had. So Rue and Jules are once again in a relationship. However, still unknown to Jules, Rue's relationship with hard narcotics is still going as strong as ever, no thanks to Elliot, a character new to this season and someone for Rue to do drugs with. I get what they're doing. By giving Rue everything she could want, she's eventually going to have to make a choice, love or lust. I guess lust isn't really the right word, but love or crippling addiction doesn't really roll off the tongue as well, does it? Let's talk about Jules for a second, because the show certainly doesn't want to. I'm not gonna lie, this one hurts. She went from being the most interesting character in Season 1 to virtually having nothing to do with this season outside of being an eventual goal for Rue, so with how short this section is admittedly going to be, let's start with the good. In Season 1, Jules is still very much coming to terms mentally with her transition. She admits in her special episode that during this time she was very much overcompensating by looking and acting like a traditional girly girl. She saw femininity as an obstacle to conquer, and in Season 2 we finally get to see this come into fruition. It's clear that she's much more comfortable in her skin through the way she acts and dresses, yet it's something that the show never directly calls attention to. It's this season's best example of show don't tell done well. Bars. But let's circle back to her relationship with Rue, and I guess more specifically Elliot. Jules is initially very suspicious of Elliot's motives, but eventually they get closer, and then maybe a little bit too close, and as I was watching this I was like, okay, cool, this is kind of interesting, maybe this dynamic won't be as surface level as I once thought. And then it's never brought up again. In fact, both Jules and Elliot are effectively written out of the story at around this point, so I guess let's get back to Rue. In true drug addict fashion, she is burning bridges left and right and resorting to any means necessary to get her next fix. I think the absolute rock bottom of the series comes in episode 3 when Rue gives the audience detailed instructions on how to manipulate your loved ones, which the show does rightfully treat as a terrible, no good, very bad thing, but the whole sequence is glazed in this ambivalent meta-ness. Almost like it's parading around how edgy the show is by having a flawed main character, so any nuance the scene could have had is ruined by the show shoving its writing up its own ass. Anyway, Rue, posing as a dealer, scores big when she hits up Fez's supplier in order to get a suitcase full of $10,000 worth of drugs. Now, based on my admittedly limited knowledge of how drug dealers work, Rue's plan, which again is to steal drug, get high, has basically a 100% chance of ending in her death, so surely if this is being given so much setup, there must be some sort of... You know what, I'll spare you. It's cul-de-sacs all around, baby. Nothing but dead ends here. Which is a shame because episode 5, which is the culmination of Rue's struggle with addiction, is far and away the most competent episode this season. But after this, her addiction just kinda stops being a problem, and her screen time is mostly limited to exploring the emotional fallout of her actions and the effect she's had on those around her. Which structurally I do kind of think is clever, but it's not really given the time or depth that I think something that heavy deserves. So in summation, this part of the story has good bones, but what really nags at me here is Elliot, because on paper this kind of personification of drugs should work, but the thing is, the personification has to be a person, you know, with hopes and dreams and shit. I don't know anything about the guy, and as soon as we start to get a little bit of characterization, Levinson decides maybe the show would be better if we didn't capitalize on everything we set up. So as it stands, Elliot just seems like a really forced wedge to shove in between Rue and Jules. Really forced when you consider that Rue and Jules' relationship more or less ends exactly how it started at the beginning of the season. A lot of missed opportunities here, but I guess that means more time was spent fleshing out the secondary cast. Right? So there's been a lot of discussion as to why Euphoria takes place in a high school. I mean, if the cast was a little bit older, it would certainly make a lot of the sex stuff less weird. I'd be able to buy how these kids have access to copious amounts of drugs a little bit more, and I wouldn't have to ask myself, what the fuck are the adults doing in the show to not notice any of the insane shit that's happening around them? But I'm not so naive to say that dropping these characters in college would automatically make the show better. I mean, I'd like to think that the writers thought about the setting in a way that goes deeper than, oh my god, guys. Wasn't high school so fucking epic? And it's not like they were aiming for realism because, like, come on. Do I have to say it? If they really wanted to be realistic, they'd add a side character who's addicted to masturbating every day during their 6th period history class. Side note, if you're watching this, everyone knew. Everyone could tell exactly what you were doing. You're not fucking slick. Anyways, I think the main reason the writers chose to do this is because if all the main players in your story are still in high school, it forces the characters to interact with one another. I mean, think about how unnatural it feels when, for example, Maddie talks to Root. These two already feel like they're from two completely different shows, so think about how much more unnatural it would feel if these two interacted without the writers even having a reason for them to be in the same building as each other. The setting is a blessing and a curse, and I can't think of a better way this is exemplified than through Nate Jacobs. In basically every way, Nate Jacobs is a mustache-twirling Saturday morning cartoon villain. He is simply too unbelievably evil for me to buy him as a high school student, but at the same time, the restrictions that come with the post-pubescent backdrop of Euphoria are the only things that facilitate Nate to work as the little sinner he is. So let's go back through season 1 and take a look at the many crimes this deranged teenage boy has committed. I tried to make that sound funny, but it's really not, so, let's just get this over with. He both mentally and physically abuses his significant other constantly. He beat the absolute neon glitter aesthetic out of that one guy and then proceeded to frame him for the aforementioned crime. And last but certainly still a felony, let's not forget the time Nathaniel Jake Jacobs manipulated and extorted the new trans girl at his school so he could get away with the previous 2 crimes. So surely there must be a reason why he acts like this, right? So let's go back through season 1 and take a look at all of his motivations. Drumroll please. He has none. Well, it's not exactly true. He found his dad's porn collection at a young age and is therefore insecure about his sexuality, but still, I feel like we skipped a couple steps from relatively well-adjusted kid to sociopath. I mean, most kids who watch their dad have gay sex cope by masturbating during their 6th period history class, which is not great, but it's a far cry away from winning Twitter cancellation qualification bingo all before you're legally able to drink. I want to clarify that writing your big bad this way isn't inherently a big bad thing to do, but what you're not going to do is tell me I should empathize with the good-for-nothing rapscallion just because he's a troubled boy who tries his best. So imagine my surprise when Season 2, Episode 2 opens with this.
Nate Jacobs was in love.
First off, no, I do not care if Nate is in love. I have been given no reason to care or even believe that Nate is in love. I'm pretty sure Nate doesn't even believe Nate is in love. We've only ever seen him act in his own best interest, and the only reason this isn't blatant character assassination is because they throw in a line about him possibly having brain damage after promptly getting his skull caved in. Second of all, I don't even feel like I need a second thing because it's so obvious. Like, hey, maybe don't try to redeem the irredeemable, he says, shouting into the vaguely metrosexual void known as the Euphoria writer's room. But alas, no one is there to answer his call, his plea for a better script. Anyway, they do the exact same thing with Nate's dad. At least Cal has the self-awareness and the emotional intelligence to understand exactly what his place in the world is, but still, this was the first thing we saw him do. And yes, I know he didn't think he was doing anything that illegal at the time, but I don't exactly think that would hold up in court considering he filmed it without Jules' consent. But nah, give him a sad backstory about how he's a closeted gay man. That totally unfucks that child. To be fair, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. Most of the time, the show doesn't really go out of its way to reward bad behavior. In fact, Nate doesn't really have a lot to do this season. There's the love triangle, which... oh my god, we'll get to it. And the ongoing feud he has with his father, which the show treats as a much bigger deal than it actually is. Nate is upset with Cal because, I don't know, he made him look at a penis, and Cal is justifiably upset with himself for raising Ted Bundy the sequel, so, you know... it's a tale as old as time, really. But for as much as a supposed rift there is between the two characters, we never really get to see it. I mean, they wrestle on the floor that one time, but mostly there's just an unspoken bitterness between the two that lasts until Cal caves in and moves out and moves back into a prison cell, so add another tally on the ongoing list of Euphoria plot points that went nowhere but still somehow tripped over themselves. Alright, let's talk about it. Sex, am I right? Now normally this is something I wouldn't touch with a 39.5-foot pole, and like, I get it, this is a real oh, so we're gonna let the talking cheese preach to us moment, but sex is such a big part of Euphoria, there's basically no version of this script where I'm able to ignore it. I think sex is important and a valid part of life, and it's equally valid to portray sexual relationships in media, ideally in a way that surfaces the plot. However, that point does come with a tiny little asterisk, that being, if your name is Sam Levinson, these rules do not apply to you. If your name is Sam Levinson, you get all your human rights revoked. The sexual content in Euphoria, especially season 2, is gratuitous to say the least. As someone who is attracted to both men and women, there are far too many naked men and women this season. I promise you, I can go 5 minutes without seeing penis, balls, dick, ass, boobs, or cock. And this is made all the more difficult to watch when you consider that most of the characters having graphic intercourse in the show are minors, and mind you, this is the same show whose plot hinges on the law surrounding the creation and distribution of child porn. So, I don't know, this just seems like a really weird way to have your underage cake and eat it too. Also, there's virtually no middle ground when it comes to portraying a character's sexuality. In the eyes of Levinson, you are either asexual or asexual menace to society. But the character who, in terms of the unnecessary sex stuff, really gets the shaft, no pun intended, is Cassie Howard. She's a character who, in this season, is defined by a desperate need for validation, and most of her actions go to show us how she'll go to any lengths to get it. In this case, that means a relationship, and unfortunately for the audience who has to witness this audiovisual hell unfold before them, Nate's on the menu, baby. So much of this season is dominated by this love triangle, which is the most infuriating thing to watch simply because all parties involved think they're in the right, yet none of them have enough distance from the situation or realize that they're all failed human beings. Actually, maybe that's not exactly fair to say about Maddie, because she clearly is the victim in the situation, but in a lot of ways she's the one element here that makes or breaks this whole subplot. We're told over and over again, "Ay caramba, we don't want Maddie to find out we're having sex. She's gonna go absolutely ballistic." And then she never does. Surprisingly, a lot of Maddie's character this season is defined by passivity. At the beginning of the season, she's in possession of the disc, the porn disc that could drastically alter the dynamics of the show and could maybe lead to something interesting. Just maybe. Instead, it's not brought up until episode 6 when Nate breaks into Maddie's house to steal the disc and then he gives it to Jules, who then destroys it. Awesome. Good to know that none of that mattered and that time is a flat fucking circle. So to recap a bit here, we have a love triangle featuring someone whose only real influence over the story is implied, a walking ball of testosterone who doesn't really care what the outcome is as long as he can stick his dick in something, and Cassie, who spends this season being really pathetic. And that's basically all she has to do. Be pathetic. I'm gonna be honest, I had a hard time writing this part of the script because everything surrounding this character, it reads like fan fiction. Like, she technically propels the plot forward and she technically has agency, but all roads end in her having more sex with Nate, so why should I give a shit? It really does feel like a certain little showrunner has a big old crush on Sydney Sweeney, so he has to awkwardly work in an excuse for nudity in all of her scenes. And again, my issue is not with the fact that the plot calls for sex scenes, it's that sometimes these episodes feel like a series of sex scenes that are occasionally interrupted by plot, and at that point, I might as well just be watching Cal's porn disc. Speaking of things that should have never happened, I want to touch on the direction throughout these scenes because it's especially bad here. Levinson must be a firm believer in the idea that yelling and crying a lot equals good acting, considering how virtually every scene with these three characters devolves into a screaming competition. And it's not like I can even point fingers at anyone else here because I've seen these actors give more subtle performances. In fact, I've seen it in this fucking show, so I can only come to the conclusion that somewhere along the way someone forgot to translate all of this melodrama into actual drama. Either that or Levinson believes that if his actors scream and cry and piss themselves enough, the Academy will squirt out some more Emmys for him. This is the part of the video where I talk about everyone else. Sorry, normally I would try to wine and dine you a little bit more than that, but what can I say? I'm drained and Euphoria has inspired me to give in to my laziness. Leave me the fuck alone. And speaking of being left alone, does anyone remember McKay? Because I can think of a certain someone who wishes I forgot. McKay was far and away the most basic cookie-cutter character in the first season. He is the merriest of Mary Sues and was only really interesting in the context of his relationship with Cassie. Levinson seems to know this all too well, so McKay is written out of the season after the first episode. I mean, he can't interact with Cassie because she's too busy partaking in Nate's soup. And Lord forbid McKay's involvement here lead to anything dramatic happening in this teen drama. Not that I was exactly begging for more McKay content, but as a writer, this is supposed to be the part where you come in and do the whole your job bit and create a character people can connect with. You know who's a character a lot of people connected with? Kat. You know, Kat from the show I'm currently talking about. Again, you might have forgotten she's in the show because she has count 'em, 2 whole scenes this season. Apparently, Barbie Ferreira, Kat's actress, fought with Sam Levinson because she didn't like the direction that he was taking her character in, and as a result, he cut most of her scenes out. And I don't know, if you're gonna be a showrunner who can't take criticism, maybe you should find a different line of work, something where being that unnecessarily petty and disrespectful towards your colleagues is the norm.
Vote Levinson U.S. Senator 2022.
Let's look at the content of these scenes because it's not like it's gonna take us a long time. This season, Kat is plagued by a vague self-hatred, which, hold on, I thought the whole point of her arc in season 1 is that she overcame this, right? I mean, she spends the whole season trying to make a genuine connection with someone, and then she finds this through Ethan, a boy who genuinely does love Kat for who she is. But in season 2, she just kinda decides, maybe I don't like my perfect life anymore. And I honestly don't know how to describe this any further than that because it's so out of place and was so obviously written out of obligation instead of inspiration. Anyway, Kat is struggling with her inner demons, and in her first scene, nearly every word of what I just said is challenged because the scene consists of Kat's consciousness manifesting itself as a bunch of Instagram influencers yelling self-affirmations at her. This is another case of good idea, poor execution, because essentially I do agree with what the scene is saying. Being told to love yourself if you don't love yourself is not helpful at all, and it's especially not helpful if you're being told this by thousands of faceless people through thousands of screens. However, that does not make this any less goofy. So, Kat is unhappy. Got it. Understood. Crystal clear. So, as many unhappy people do, she decides to deliberately make her life worse by completely destroying any goodwill left between her and Ethan. They're having dinner, and Kat attempts to break up with Ethan, like a normal person at first, but then she decides to split the difference, I guess. So she tells him she has a terminal brain condition and is dying. Ethan obviously sees through this and is like, you're obviously trying to break up with me, so just do it like an adult, please. And Kat is like, lol, virgin, and then Ethan leaves. So what was the point? The only thing that whole series of incredibly unfortunate events accomplished is that it made me dislike Kat more. If I didn't know better, I would assume that this scene was just from a weirdly high-budget episode of Impractical Jokers. Sending this relationship off this way is so bizarre, I cannot wrap my head around it. We have literally only ever seen Ethan as a charismatic, funny, kind, all-around good dude, whose biggest flaw is, I guess he likes going down on his girlfriend a little too much. Gee, what a fucking piece of shit, am I right, ladies?
Didn't I do it for you? Why don't I do it for you? Why won't you do it for me? When all I do is for you. They wanna
Actually, I guess Ethan is a theater kid, so maybe he did have it coming to him. Ah, the theater. You know, it's a funny thing because plays are a very ancient concept, primordial almost. I mean, a bunch of silly guys dress up in silly costumes and act like other silly guys. Dinner and a show? More like dinner and a no. I'm kidding, of course. I do not actually care at all. But what is interesting is that in the face of new media, the theater is constantly playing a game of catch-up. It has to strive to be something more, something that maybe looks a lot like Euphoria. But at the same time, Euphoria wishes it was a play so bad, and I do not know which is sadder. Enter Lexi. In contrast to Kat, she's a character who has a lot more screen time this season, and yeah, I don't really have a lot to complain about here. Probably the most clever writing trick Levinson pulls this season is through Lexi. She very much sees herself as a bystander in her own life, so this season she writes and produces a play based on the events of the show, in an attempt not only to create something original that she can call her own, but also to liberate herself in a way. It's something pretty simple that changes all of her inaction in the previous season to action this season. As for the play itself, look, I could go the obvious route and talk about how this play has basically no real in-universe reason for existing. I'd say that there's absolutely no way any American high school would approve, produce, and fund a play which A, has no real plot, and B, pretty much only exists to spread gossip about real people. And all of that is true, but this isn't fucking CinemaSins. The show wears all of this like a badge of honor, as if to say fuck you directly to anybody watching this who still cares about things like continuity or quality or anything other than Cal pissing on the floor. This play is basically Levinson's wet dream. It gives him a free pass to do whatever he wants in whatever order he wants for whatever reason he wants, all while jerking off over past events of a show that he wrote. Something something, death of an author, something something. And it's not even like the play leads to anything meaningfully dramatic. I mean, Nate gets hate crimed a little bit, Maddie throws hands with Cassie off screen, and Elliot definitely is there. So it's hard for me to see this as anything other than a way to ascribe significance to an otherwise pretty vapid season of television. The other major thing Lexi has going on is her relationship with Fezco, which at first definitely felt like the writers scrambling to meet their teen drama relationship quota, but rare moment of sincerity time, I like these two a lot. They're really cute together, and I just like them a lot. Kind of a shame about the everything though. I kinda see Fez as the sprinkles on top of the Euphoria sundae. Does he make or break the experience? No. But he is there. I think part of this is because of how disconnected he is from the main plot. I mentioned earlier about how Maddie and Rue feel like they're from completely different shows. I don't know what fucking show Fez is from. Something like Riverdale meets Breaking Bad, but with 50% less minorities and incest. Credit where it's due, they did try. Fez has a lot more screen time here than in the first season, and his scenes are a lot more liberally sprinkled throughout these episodes. His subplot revolves around his fellow drug
business associate
snitching on him, and I don't know, while this setup is properly set up, and I do have attachment to Fez the person, I can't really say the same about Fez the
business associate.
I have no idea how big or small Fezco's operation is, if he's even good at dealing, or what he has to lose if he were to stop, and the show can't ever explore that side of the character because this is Euphoria. You know, the show whose main character is a struggling addict. If we ever did get any more information on this side of Fez, it would only make the audience like him less because we see up close and personally exactly how addiction can ruin lives, and I think old Sammy knows this. It's why it's never really a focus, and even when it is, he pulls really cheap writing tricks to keep us invested. For example, killing a 12-year-old boy via police shootout, which is like the bad joke answer to the question, how do I emotionally engage with my audience? Fez has always been an anomaly in the show's cast, but unlike the rest of the show's underdeveloped characters, I can't really think of an easy fix for him. But I guess Levinson can't think of anything either, since it looks like he'll be spending season 3 kicking it with Cal in the fucking slammer. Originally, when I first began writing this video, I started out by going on a big long tirade about the word pretentious and how it's a word that has kind of evolved over time and as such has basically lost all meaning. And then I would have tied it all together in the end by saying calling something pretentious isn't necessarily a bad thing because it implies aspiration. It's reaching for something greater even if it can't quite get there. But when I wrote that, I kind of expected to like the whole season, which I don't. So instead, I'm going to try to write a conclusion that mirrors the ending of Euphoria Season 2. You know, something that isn't really earned and that comes completely out of nowhere.
More than the greatest love the world has known, this is the love that I give to you alone. More than